let's read these and then we can talk about it a bit, because there are a number of people on the sort of abolish ICE train right now. That's going to be a really hard sell, because Republicans are going to push back on that in every possible way and continue to try to make it sound ridiculous. So it's going to be really hard to convince people that it's not ridiculous, because it seems to be coming out of nowhere. But if you, let's listen to this, and let's take the time to unpack it a little bit. So this is from The Nation, and it's entitled, "It's Time to Abolish ICE." And it reads as follows. So Dan Cannon is running for Congress in Indiana's 9th District this year. A career civil rights lawyer, Cannon filed one of the cases against gay marriage bans that eventually became the landmark Obergefell versus Hodge, and he proudly wore a notorious RBG shirt under his suit to the Supreme Court. He is currently representing individuals suing Donald Trump for inciting violence at his rallies. Cannon has also defended clients swept up by immigration and customs enforcement raids, and fought a Kafkaesque deportation system that at one point wouldn't even disclose the location of his client. Now Cannon believes ICE should be abolished entirely. Quote, "I don't think a lot of people have any kind of direct experience with ICE, so they don't really know what they do or what they're about. If they did, they'd be appalled," Cannon told me. ICE, as it presently exists, is an agency devoted almost solely to cruelly and wantonly breaking up families. The agency talks about and treats human beings like they're animals. They scoop up people in their apartments or their workplaces and take them miles away from their spouses and children. The idea of defunding ICE has gained traction among immigrant rights groups, horrified by the speed at which, under President Donald Trump, the agency has ramped up an already brutal deportation process. Mary Small, policy director at Detention Watch Network, said, "Responsible policymakers need to be honest about the fact that the core of the agency is broken." Her group led the charge to defund ICE with its Defund Hate campaign last year. Groups like Indivisible Project and the Center for Popular Democracy have also called for defunding ICE. Brand New Congress, a progressive PAC, has the proposal in its immigration platform. Quote, "ICE is terrorizing American communities right now," said Angel Padilla, policy director at the Indivisible Project. "They're going into schools, entering hospitals, conducting massive raids, and separating children from parents every day. We are funding those activities, and we need to use all the leverage we have to stop it." Though ICE abolition is spreading on the left, it quickly meets extreme skepticism elsewhere, which is what I was just talking about. In part, this is because the mainstream political discourse has a huge blind spot for the agency's increasingly brutal policies. While elites have generally become concerned with rising authoritarianism, they have mainly ignored the purges ICE is conducting in immigrant communities. For example, in their recent book, How Democracies Die, Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky, who we talked about 2 weeks ago, did not mention ICE at all. Centrist pundits like Jonathan Chait have dedicated thousands of words to the threat of PC culture on college campuses, but haven't found time to question whether an opaque and racist deportation force might pose a larger threat to democracy than campus editorial pages. Others tend to dismiss ICE abolition as more of a troll than a serious policy demand. Josh Barrow, a senior editor at Business Insider, argued that progressives have not paired the proposal with a plan to do the function without the hated agency. But the goal of abolishing the agency is to abolish the function. ICE has become a genuine threat to democracy, and it is destroying thousands of lives. Moreover, abolishing it would only take us back to 2003, when the agency was first formed. Now, editorial aside, I think many people do not have any idea of this. They don't know this at all. So ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, was formed in 2003. That's not very long ago. So did we have anarchy and chaos and open borders and all that before then? No. ICE was formed as part of the so-called War on Terror. So we'll get back to this story, but I'm just making that point. I want you to think about that, because if people are saying abolish ICE, it's like, oh, the reaction tends to be people going, oh, well, what, you know, we'll have no function. I mean, immigrants will run wild in the streets and all that stuff. But no, that's not the case. That didn't happen before. It wouldn't happen now. ICE is a very specific job with immigration enforcement. That's what people are complaining about, not that someone has to be in charge of immigration or that someone has to deal with those kinds of problems and those situations, but that ICE, as it is formed, as it operates, is not that agency. So back to the story. So ICE was a direct product of the post-September 11 panic culture and was created in the legislation Congress passed in the wake of the attacks. From the start, the agency was paired with the brand new Department of Homeland Security's increased surveillance of communities of color and immigrant communities. By putting ICE under the scope of DHS, the government framed immigration as a national security issue rather than an issue of community development, diversity, or human rights. That's not to say America's deportation policies only got bad in 2003, nor that it hasn't been a bipartisan project. When he was a senior advisor to then-President Bill Clinton, Rahm Emanuel wrote that Clinton should work to, quote, claim and achieve record deportations of criminal aliens, end quote. When Republicans gave Clinton the chance to do this with the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, he jumped at it. The IIRIRA set up the legal infrastructure for mass deportations and expanded the number of crimes considered deportable. Clinton's blessing also harshened the political atmosphere around immigration. As recently as 2006, Democrats still explicitly used anti-immigrant sentiment as a campaign tactic. During his failed Tennessee Senate run, Harold Ford Jr. ran ads warning that, quote, every day almost 2,000 people enter America illegally. Every day hundreds of employers look the other way, handing out jobs that keep illegals coming, and every day the rest of us pay the price, end quote. Even Barack Obama, while he made pains to distinguish between, quote, good and, quote, bad immigrants, presided over aggressive deportation tactics in his first term in order to build support for a path to citizenship that never came. The central assumption of ICE in 2018 is that any undocumented immigrant is inherently a threat. In that way, ICE's tactics are philosophically aligned with racist thinkers like Richard Spencer and the writers at the white supremacist journal V-Dare. ICE's modus operandi under Trump bears a striking resemblance to the strategy proposed by white supremacist Jared Taylor in 2015. Quote, the key, however, would be a few well-publicized raids on non-criminal illegals. Television images of Mexican families dropped over the border with no more than they could carry would be very powerful. The vast majority of illegals would quickly decide to get their affairs in order and choose their own day of departure rather than wait for ICE to choose it for them. The main thing would be to convince illegals that ICE was serious about kicking them out. Ironically, the more ICE was prepared to do, the less it would have to do, end quote. This is a near-perfect summary of ICE under Acting Director Thomas Homan, who has repeatedly made clear that all undocumented residents should be afraid of his agents. Think about that. Should be afraid of his agents. Quote, you should look over your shoulder and you need to be worried, he boasted in his congressional testimony last year. Homan does not, by the way, he's no longer head of ICE, but this is apparently out of date too. Homan does not apply any light touch when expressing his authoritarian tendencies. He has threatened to jail and prosecute local officials in so-called sanctuary cities that do not fully comply with ICE mandates. The agency has also clearly been targeting political opponents for deportations and has worked to deport individuals for speaking to media about ICE. Homan's authoritarian saber-rattling has essentially been ignored in the mainstream political dialogue. But the candidates and activists I spoke with hear it loud and clear. So do the communities they represent. And another editorial aside, this is what I was talking about at the very beginning of the program, and why the focus on national immigration policy and issues is part and parcel of dealing with what people are going through in the community, because the people in the communities are being affected by these actions specifically, and they are being affected by them emotionally, subjectively, through what they hear in the news, read in the newspaper, and so on. So they get it coming from two different directions, both from actual events and from fear-mongering and fear creeping in and just making you feel unsafe in your own home, in your own community, at your own workplace, and things like that. And that's a feeling that I don't think very many people can understand. If you've never felt that, it's like, well, you just shouldn't worry, you should just go, it's just, there's a lot of people telling you what you should do who have no understanding of what it's like to have to try to do those things. And so this is a very important point. When these people make these kind of pronouncements, even when the mainstream political dialogue is ignoring them, and even the media is only barely reporting on them, the people whose lives are concerned, whose welfare and well-being are concerned, are hearing this stuff. It gets to them eventually. And it gets to them, literally. Anyway, back to our story. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is challenging, has now won, Joe Crowley in New York's 14th Congressional District, which covers part of the Bronx and Queens, told me she believes that, quote, after a long and protracted history of sexual assault and uninvestigated deaths in ICE detention facilities, as well as the corrosive impact ICE has had on our schools, courts, and communities, it's time to reset course. New York's 14th district is among the most diverse and immigrant-heavy in the country. Ocasio-Cortez not only supports defunding ICE, but also wants a full congressional inquiry into ICE enforcement and detention practices. She further argues for a truth and reconciliation process for victims of any potential sexual assault, neglect, and misconduct discovered as a result. Kanalia Ng, I don't know how to pronounce that. Kanela Ng, maybe, a member of the Hawaii State Legislature currently running for the House in the state's 1st District, has also endorsed defunding ICE, tweeting this week that, quote, when they say defund Planned Parenthood and destroy millions of lives, we say defund ICE and save millions of lives. Suraj Patel, a child of immigrants, is running a well-funded insurgent campaign against Democratic incumbent Representative Carolyn Maloney in New York's 12th Congressional District. He would vote to defund ICE if he makes it to Congress. ICE has crossed a red line under this president by harassing, pursuing, and terrorizing immigrants and activists all over this country with impunity. These mass deportations are forcing immigrants to live in fear while making the rest of us less safe, he said. Defunding ICE and returning it to be a passport patrol and customs enforcement agency rather than an above-the-law deportation squad is a critical step to protecting all Americans and our civil liberties. Granted, this position might not fly everywhere in the country, but Hillary Clinton won the 12th district with 83% of the vote, and candidates like Patel are trying to shift the Overton window. We miss an incredible opportunity when we allow districts like ours to be safe havens for the status quo, Patel said. There is increasing support for limiting or even ending cooperation. That's my Elmer Fudd impression. Sorry. There is an increasing support for limiting or even ending cooperation with ICE at the state level, too. Abdul El-Sayed, a gubernatorial candidate in Michigan, told me that he will not waste a dime of state taxpayer money to enforce laws that would tear apart families and tear apart our economy. Jessica Ramos, who is running for the New York State Senate seat in Queens, has also endorsed defunding ICE. Instead of making our communities safer, ICE has taught immigrants to fear and distrust law enforcement, she said. It's absolutely time to defund the agency and start working on real common sense immigration reform. Ramos's opponent in the primary, Jose Peralta, joined the Independent Democratic Caucus in the State House last year, which is a group of politicians who were elected as Democrats, formed a power-sharing agreement with Republicans. He claimed this would position him to bring tuition benefits and protections to undocumented immigrants, but those benefits have not materialized, though he has gotten a nice pay raise thanks to the GOP. The call to abolish ICE is, above all, a demand for the Democratic Party to begin seriously resisting an unbridled white supremacist surveillance state that it had a hand in producing. Though the party has moved left on core issues from reproductive rights to single-payer health care, it's time for progressives to put forward a demand that deportation be taken not as the norm, but rather as a disturbing indicator of authoritarianism. White supremacy can no longer be the center of the immigration debate. Democrats have voted to fully fund ICE with limited fanfare because in the American immigration discussion, the right-wing position is the center and the left has no voice. There has been disturbing word fatigue around mass deportation, and the threat of deportation is so often taken lightly that many have lost the ability to conceptualize what it means. Next to death, being stripped from your home, family, and community is the worst fate that can be inflicted on a human, as many societies practicing banishments have recognized. It's time to rein in the greatest threat we face, an unaccountable strike force executing a campaign of ethnic cleansing. And it makes an interesting point here. There's a lot in history about how England used to send away its criminals after the period where they were basically everything was a death penalty crime. You steal a loaf of bread and you could get the death penalty. They started banishing people to the colonies as a way of, dealing with crime. And none of those things worked, by the way. But they did certainly hurt people, obviously, when you're killing them or deporting them, you're hurting them. So it's more just an act of terror and an act of aggression than anything else. But let's read this next article really quickly. We have a few minutes left here. So this is from Vox, and it's called Abolish ICE Explained. So before President Donald Trump, only immigrants and their neighbors were likely to know what the acronym ICE stands for, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the agency tasked with identifying, detaining, and deporting people in the U.S. who have violated immigration law. Under Trump, it's become a household name, even in the households that don't have to worry about its agents knocking on their doors. As the people on the ground carrying out Trump's deportation agenda, ICE agents have become, to many, the face of the administration's worst impulses. They're America's Gestapo. They're a rogue agency. Rumors and reports of ICE raids have rippled through communities and social media with regularity. Arrests of parents recorded on their children's cell phone cameras have provoked nationwide outrage. The problem for progressives isn't just that ICE is part of the Trump administration. Increasingly, they are opposed to the idea of the agency itself. It's time, wrote Sean McElwee in The Nation, the article I just read, to abolish ICE. Resistance to ICE and to deportation isn't new. Immigrant groups have been fighting the expansion of immigration enforcement for years, but public outrage over the Trump administration's quote-unquote zero-tolerance border policy, which separated thousands of families, has intensified the skepticism over immigration enforcement. Abolish ICE is becoming a catch-all rallying cry against draconian immigration policies. me again. That's on top of the dim prospects for any congressional deal to address the status of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program and the hundreds of thousands of young undocumented immigrants who depend on it. Activists believe it's now even more important to push back against aggressive immigration enforcement. Leading D.C.-based immigrant rights groups, including United We Dream, are currently urging members of Congress to refuse to appropriate any money to enforce Trump's agenda. Excuse me again. Boy, my throat gets really dry here. What McElwee is pushing, which has become something of a meme among segments of the left, seems more radical than just cutting funding for the agency. It has the virtue of seeming, to progressives, like the sort of big thinking that conservatives engage in and Democrats often don't. In practice, it's a slogan that encompasses both incremental proposals, like cutting funding for deportations, and radical ones like abolishing deportation itself, something that not everyone using abolish ICE as a Twitter hashtag necessarily agrees with. But Trump's decision to separate families is giving traction to an idea that otherwise might have stayed on the fringes. It's turning into a common protest refrain. It's becoming part of some progressive politicians' platforms, and one lawmaker, Representative Mark Pocan, is introducing House legislation to abolish ICE. At the moment, the idea of abolishing ICE hasn't caught on with high-profile national Democrats. In March, MSNBC's Chris Hayes asked Senator Kamala Harris, arguably the most progressive member of the Senate on immigration, if she supports it. Harris, often mentioned as a contender for the presidential nomination in 2020, defended the need for ICE as an agency, even if she disapproved of what has been done under Trump. This month, Harris still wasn't ready to come out in favor of abolishing ICE, but she appeared to express greater skepticism about the agency's work. Quote, "I think there's no question that we've got to critically re-examine ICE and its role and the way that it is being administered and the work it does." I'm sorry, I may have to quit talking here. And to continue her quote, she says, "And we need to probably think about starting from scratch because there's a lot that is wrong with the way it's conducting itself, and we have to deal with it." It's probably not going to be the last time Harris and other national politicians are asked the question. Progressives are increasingly frustrated by a long-standing truth. The Democratic Party has often been a willing partner in building up the immigration enforcement apparatus that Trump has now taken advantage of. The longer that progressives reckon with what Trump is doing with ICE, the more questions they might have about whether it's a good idea for any president to have that kind of power, and the more likely they might be to ask those questions of anyone who wants to be the Democratic Party's nominee in 2020. Sorry, I'm really losing my voice here. Sorry again. I'm instead of reading is really the hard thing for me because it just kind of keeps going, and I can't stop and rest in between words like I can when I'm talking. The point of all of this that I think people are trying to make, let's step back from what some people would describe as the extreme position on this and say, but isn't immigration, aren't undocumented immigrants a problem? Don't we need some sort of agency responsible for dealing with this problem? Well, first of all, the question is, aren't undocumented immigrants a problem? And I would say that no, they really aren't a problem. There are problems associated with it, undocumented immigration, with people coming here not through legal channels. There are problems associated with it. But the process of someone coming to this country is not in itself a problem. It is not in itself a threat. And that's where the conversation needs to be moved back well back from where it has been for a long time. There's this notion that anyone coming to this country is potentially a threat. Trump plays this up big time. Refugees, immigrants, like anybody coming here apparently is potentially a threat. He dances around where those people are coming from, and he's only talking about certain groups. So he will even say, like, we need more immigrants from, Norway or something like that, or Sweden. But for the most part, he just kind of creates this notion that all immigration is bad, and then crafts laws or he doesn't craft laws. He writes executive orders and urges the crafting of laws that target only people from certain areas. So that's the first trick that's being played on you, is this sort of bait and switch thing where they say immigrants are dangerous, immigrants hurt our economy, immigrants cause all these bad things. But their solutions to those bad things don't target immigrants across the board. They target certain people from certain countries. Always people of color, or people whose religion is different, or something like that. That's who is being targeted by all of this stuff. So that's the first bait and switch. They create an argument that claims that uncontrolled immigration is a bad thing. Having just people coming over here without being very careful and selective about who comes is a terrible thing. That's what they say. So who do they select and who do they focus on? Well, that's a very different thing from the broad statement that anybody coming here is a problem. If we had a sudden wave of immigrants from UK, Sweden, France, Germany, you wouldn't hear much about it. You'd hear feel-good stories about, oh, look at these, people coming here who are looking for this interesting thing, and look at their quaint customs and their interesting languages. I mean, it would just be a whole different approach. But because of who's coming here that they don't want, people of color, people who are not Christians, that's who gets targeted by these laws. So that's the first thing. We're going to have to go into this at some other time because I'm basically out of time here. But my point is, start doing a little reading on this and thinking about this, because abolish ICE is not a radical idea. What it does is it steps us back. Whoa, we've got we've got a tornado warning coming. Yeah, this is going to cut me off, so I guess I should just stop right now, because it first says it in here and then it takes over the radio. So you have been listening to CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5. We'll be back with you again next week. Until then, see you later. Bye-bye.